digital identity practices and exploring the interplay between formal and informal learning. In her PhD, she explored the use of open educational practices in higher education. She's on the advisory boards of the Open Education Working Group, Virtually Connecting, and a co-chair of the OER 19 conference, which I think she's going to mention. She's involved in teaching, research, and advocacy in higher education in the community for over 25 years, and she's a regular contributor to conversations and collaborative projects in the area of open education within Ireland and globally. And she's a born New Yorker who's made her home in Ireland, and you can find her online. Her Twitter handle is Catherine Cronin, and her website is catherinecronin.net. Looking forward to listening to you, Catherine. Thank you.
Salam, shukran, peace, and thank you so much for inviting me to be with you these 2 days, to work with you these 2 days. It's been an honor and it's been such a joy. I have learned so much already, and I'm already hoping that I'll be able to come back to Cairo and to Egypt. My title is quite long, Teaching in an Age of Complexity. I'm going to focus more on the latter part of that title, exploring open, participatory, and equitable pedagogies. And the complexity piece is just really the context, the why around those kinds of pedagogies. And let's see if my clicker works now. Okay. As in the workshop this morning, my slides and all of the references are in a Google Doc, which is open, and it's just the hashtag CLTAUC-Cronin. So if you'd like to access the slides or the references, you can get those now. Where I am on the internet. Whoops. This is me on the web. My Twitter name is @CatherineCronin. My website is catherinecronin.net, and the Twitter name for the organization that I work for is Forum TL, for Teaching and Learning. So if you find me on the web, which is usually where I'm talking most days, I was actively tweeting for the past 2 days that I was here. Most of the time you will probably find that I'm talking about OER 19. This is a conference, as Maha said, that's coming up in about 5 weeks' time, and the focus of it is open education. So I'm sharing this with you because this is my standpoint, and I'd like you to know kind of my vantage point and from where I sit, so to better understand what I'm going to be speaking about today. So I just completed a big piece of research in open education. It's an area of a lot of my work, and the hashtag there in the upper left-hand corner, if you look that up on any search engine or on Twitter, you can find a bit more about the conference, some really interesting conversations, and we're very excited about the theme this year. My co-chair is Laura Czerniewicz from the University of Cape Town, and we're going to be talking about critical and global perspectives on openness. The place that I work, I mentioned already this morning, but for those of you who weren't here this morning, it's a very long title. We just call it the National Forum most of the time. It's a small body that works across all higher education in institutions in Ireland. So we foster communication and collaboration in the areas of teaching and learning. And I used to be an educator at one institution. I used to work in a center for learning and teaching in an institution, and now I'm working in this national context. So I can relate to a lot of the things that came up this morning from faculty and from CLT people, but this is where I am now. In terms of the real life, in terms of feet on the ground, this is where I am from. I live in the west coast of Ireland, even though I'm originally from New York. And this is an area on the west coast of Ireland, that's the Atlantic Ocean that you can see there, called the Flaggy Shore. And it's called the Flaggy Shore because there are these big, broad stones that go along the sea. And some of the stones are undulating like that, and they catch the rain, and others are big, just flat stones, so they're natural flagstones. So it's called the Flaggy Shore. And Seamus Heaney, one of our national poets, wrote a beautiful poem about this part of the world called Postscript. And my favorite line of the poem is this one: "You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass." And I often think of this line, particularly when I'm doing things on the web. I often think sometimes of the spaces that I operate in, where I might be speaking to people in Cairo or New York or wherever, that sometimes the web feels like that. You are neither here nor there. It's a space, a hurry through which known and strange things pass. So maybe that's where I might start, is talking about digital spaces. And as I go on, I hope to highlight how your really digital and physical spaces are enmeshed when we're talking about learning spaces. Now this should look familiar. I'm actually very excited about this. I use an image based on this image that Alec Kouros shared yesterday in his keynote. As far as I understand, Alec, this was from your PhD over 10 years ago, yeah, where Alec talked about networked educators. So I use an image that builds up from this. I've used it for many years, but I've never done it with Alec in the room, so that makes me quite happy. This notion that Alec talked about was that we're networked educators and we're connected in so many places, from where and how we learn as individuals, as citizens, as learners, and as teachers. Our students are also networked. So our students also have existing digital identities, networks, tools that they use when they meet us in higher education. And where do we meet? We meet in various kinds of learning spaces, and the 3 spaces identified in green there show 3 ways that we might conceptualize those. Now these are not mutually exclusive. We often use all 3 of them, but we teach often in physical spaces like this room. We teach in bounded online spaces like a VLE, where you must be a member to go into that online space. And sometimes we teach in open online spaces. So we might use open tools and engage with our students on the open web. And there were some beautiful examples of this yesterday in the faculty exchange, the cooking videos, the students doing websites and marketing. I don't know if any of those faculty are here, but there were so many lovely examples shared of this. Now there may be very good reasons why we might make particular choices about the learning spaces that we decide to teach in or that students decide to learn in. And certain ones are suitable for certain things, but the point of these arrows in the bottom here is that if we teach only in physical spaces or bounded online spaces, it's very difficult to share what we're doing in those spaces out with our networks or to invite our networks into the conversations we're having in those learning spaces, whether those be our networks or our students' networks. In open online spaces, that kind of sharing is facilitated. It's much more possible and it's invited. So, of course, our pedagogies aren't determined by the learning spaces we teach in. Our pedagogies are determined by human choices as teachers, based on our philosophies of teaching and learning, our values, and so on. So, one of the things that might determine our choices around pedagogies is the context that we teach in and the context of higher education. And one of the ways that this can be conceptualized is a term that was coined by Henry Jenkins and his team, the New Media Literacies team at MIT, called Participatory Culture. So this was kind of mid-2000s work that Henry and others were working on, and it was a response really to the identification that the web was being used as a consumer web. People were consuming on the web but not creating on the web. So they looked at people who were actually creating on the web, and this was called Web 2.0 at the time. And these were the kinds of activities they observed about people who engage in participatory culture in digital spaces. And I'd like you to think again about some of the examples that were shared by faculty yesterday, about Alec's keynote yesterday, some of the YouTube examples by children, by students, by teachers. And these are the kinds of activities that characterize participatory culture. There are low barriers to artistic expression and civic engagement. You can just shoot a YouTube video and get it up on the web right now. There's strong support for creation and sharing. So those people that invited feedback about photographs or activities that they were trying that they were having difficulty learning, they also experienced informal mentorship from others. Here's how you can do that better, because they shared that openly. They didn't get that help from people they knew. They shared openly, and they got that help from people who found their open resources. Members also believe that their contributions matter, and there's an element of social connection when we share openly. So this notion of participatory culture has been influential in many areas of work, but particularly in education. And I suppose really most interesting for us is to think about what are called the literacy practices of participatory culture. So if this is the context that we and our students, as I say, learn and teach and live and love in, what are the literacy practices that are required to engage in participatory culture. And these are some of them. And again, these were demonstrated by many of the examples shared yesterday here at the workshop. So these literacy practices are multimodal, multimedia, they're networked, they're social, they're purposeful, collaborative, and agentic. And that word agentic really just denotes the fact that those who contribute have agency to decide all of these things. The voice in how they contribute, the topic, the content, the genre. Is it serious? Is it academic? Is it informal? Is it ironic? That's chosen. The space and place of contribution, the time and duration, and so on. So a key question for us, I think, in higher education is, to what extent are we helping learners to develop these literacy practices within higher education? Either us as individual educators or in the institution in which we work. To what extent are we helping students be able to be digital practitioners as well as disciplinary practitioners? Henry Jenkins and other colleagues, Mimi Ito and Dana Boyd, updated their work a few years after they first published it, and now they call it increasingly participatory culture. And the reason for this is interesting, and it's actually a term that I use in my own work now also, where I talk about increasingly digital, networked, and participatory culture. And why is that? The reason is that the web doesn't flatten all hierarchies. And again, this came up in some examples yesterday. We know that although it is a good space for communication and collaboration, it's also a space for online harassment, for bullying, for trolling, for fake news, for surveillance, for data about you to be collected, and so on. So this is the conundrum we face as educators. We know that all of this, all of these wonderful things are possible on the open web, but we also need the literacies, the digital web data and information literacies to be able to act wisely in those spaces and to support our students to do that as well. So equity is an important issue. As I said, because we know that the web doesn't flatten social hierarchies, and in fact, in some cases it can exacerbate inequalities rather than flatten them. Goran Thurborn talks about a definition of equality as equality of capability to function fully as a human being. So we know that inequality is increasing in the world, and we know that inequality is a violation of human rights. So if we as educators want to teach in ways where we actively combat structural inequalities experienced by the students in our classroom, online tools and spaces are not going to do that work for us. This has to be intentional work, and we support each other in doing it. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. There was one more thing I wanted to say there. Yes, and I mean, this is really why I chose the context of complexity. Because we can talk about complexity in many ways. Within higher education, there are complexities. We have changing student demographics, increasing student numbers, increasing precarity of staff that work in higher education. But another way to think about complexity is the context within which higher education operates. And again, it's this enmeshing of digital and physical spaces. So there are multiple layers of complexity. And this is the context within which we all teach. So this morning we talked about context in terms of the differences between us in terms of our disciplines and our courses. And the kind of complexity that I'm talking about now, I think, are things that we all experience as professionals, as students, as learners and teachers in higher education. So the subtitle, and really the core of my keynote, is considering open, participatory, and equitable pedagogies. And I don't think they can be disentangled. So the image I use there is just a ball of wool all together. And what I talk about as open, participatory, and equitable pedagogies are things that you may have encountered elsewhere under different names. So if you've studied feminist pedagogies, if you've studied critical pedagogy, a lot of what I'm talking about here will be very familiar to you. So these are all intertwined. The open in these kinds of pedagogies are really driving us to consider, can we help ourselves and students develop the skills to learn and teach on the open web, so that we can be citizens in networked publics as well as disciplinary practitioners in networked publics. The participatory is that we don't want students to be in a situation where they're receiving an education but participating actively in it. And this gets back to the notion of student partnership that we talked about this morning in the workshop. And the notion of equity is really, are we willing to take on board the work of addressing the fact that students who we teach are experiencing, will be marginalized often in multiple and overlapping ways, and many times in ways that will be invisible to us, that we do not know. So how can we actively teach in ways that actively try to deconstruct structural inequality as much as possible? So it needs us to be very reflective about our practices, to be open to learning from feedback from our colleagues, from others, from students. And altogether, I think this is an aim that we should have to use open, participatory, and equitable pedagogies. So what I'd like to do is share a few examples and also talk about some examples of ways that people talk about this using other language. So for example, there's a webinar series going on right now called Teaching Complexity. The link is here. Oops. The clicker. It jumps. Apologies, it's very, very sticky. Yeah, sometimes I'm not touching it and it moves. Okay. The kinds of pedagogies I'm talking about are sometimes also called connected teaching practices, and this might be a term that you've heard before, connected teaching. And this is a term that Bonnie Stewart and Dave White are using now in this webinar series that I mentioned called Teaching Complexity. The hashtag there is TeachCommUAL because it's based at the University of the Arts. And once again, this really talks about the fact that boundaries are blurring. This came up in the workshop this morning. Boundaries are blurring between digital and physical identities, between teachers and learners, between teaching and learning, between offline and online, and between formal and informal learning. So this whole notion of connected learning. And I'll talk about a particular webinar that's coming up tomorrow there in just a moment. Okay. Obviously, this is a challenge, and one of the key challenges which arose in research that I did for my PhD in the last few years was one of the biggest difficulties that academic staff shared with me that they experienced in thinking about teaching in these ways was how to balance privacy and openness. So on the one hand, we can see that there will be advantages to helping students learn to be good network and digital practitioners, to share their work openly online, to understand how to understand different social media ecosystems so they can communicate as engineers, as social workers, as lawyers, and so on once they graduate. But how can we do that as individuals if we want to balance privacy? Perhaps I want to be openly online as a member of faculty, but I don't want people to see photographs of my children. So this requires digital literacies, which I think Alec is going to talk about in his workshop this afternoon, to be able to do this, to be able to balance privacy and openness, embrace the level of openness that we wish, but also have parts of ourselves perhaps that we don't want to share with the world. So this notion of balancing privacy and openness is part of being a good digital practitioner. Okay. So that's kind of the terrain of the complexity that's around us in higher education. And I'd like to invite us to think about open and equitable and participatory pedagogies. And what I did was really just look at a few examples that I think are wonderful examples. Some of them may be familiar to you, others perhaps not. So I'm going to share them, talk a little bit about perhaps how I have used them, and I hope that we'll have time at the end of this session so that you can that we can engage in conversation, because I'd love really to hear how some of these might be relevant in your work. Okay, so the first is all aboard. This notion of the fact that digital literacies are required in order for us to engage in these pedagogies. is a challenge for many of us. So many of us feel like we don't have the digital literacies we require, let alone helping our students to develop them. So All Aboard is a suite of tools developed by the National Forum, funded by the National Forum in Ireland, developed by a group of universities led by the National University of Ireland in Galway. You can find it at allaboardhe.ie. And the motif that it uses is just like a metro map. Okay, so there are different lines around things like identity, safety, sharing, communication and collaboration, and so on. And you can click on any of these stops on the metro and find a small curated list of resources to help you develop skills in those areas. You can do them yourselves, you can share them with students. I believe that some of the people in CLT are using some of the resources. Yes, Maha. So these are open educational resources. That means they're openly licensed and anyone can use them and anyone can share them with their students. Okay, another thing that's really a different way of thinking about how we might do this with our students is actually to share not only the content that we're teaching as part of our disciplinary practice, but actually some of these issues around the internet. So issues around surveillance, inequality, and so on the internet. And there are many wonderful resources for this, but the one I'll highlight is the Internet Health Report published by Mozilla. It's published every year. They have an open call to have people help them decide what are the 5 current key issues on the open web at the moment. And then for each of those 5 areas, they have articles and tools and so on to help people get to grips with that and to learn how to combat, for example, surveillance practices is one. So in the past year, openness was one of the themes that was highlighted in the Internet Health Report. And Maha and I have used this with students in a curriculum we developed, which I'll mention in a few moments. And in my experience, these are wonderful resources to use with students. The language is good, the tone is good, they're bite-sized pieces. They can be things that you can address in a particular class and knit it into whatever your discipline is, be it engineering, English, whatever that might be. And again, it's irresponsible of us to invite students to participate in the open web if we don't help them think about these issues. So these are ways that we can include those conversations in our teaching. Chris Gilyard, a US educator who I admire greatly, does just this, and this is a quote of his, and I highlighted that where he says, "In my classes, we work to recognize how digital redlining, a concept that he coined, is integrated into technologies, and especially education technologies, and is producing similar kinds of discriminatory results." So redlining is a practice in the States where different geographical areas got funding and got particular educational resources based on the social income of those areas, and this is called redlining, and Chris defines digital redlining. So this is actually done online as well, exacerbating existing inequalities. So Chris explicitly brings that into his classes so that students can engage with that concept and address it. Now, fortunately, and amazingly, in a coincidence, the Teaching Complexity webinar series that I mentioned earlier, the 5th of 5 webinars is on tomorrow from 3 to 4 p.m. GMT. And the speakers and facilitators in that are going to be Bonnie Stewart, Mahabali, and Chris Gilyard, whose slide I just showed. And they're going to be talking about inclusive spaces on the web. So for those of you who use Twitter, you'll know that these kinds of resources are shared in what's called academic Twitter very frequently. So I find, as someone who engages in this work, that these kinds of webinars and supports for us as educators and those who support educators are vitally important, because otherwise I'm trying to do this work on my own. And you might find that the time doesn't suit you, whatever, but most of them are recorded. They're available online afterwards. They're all openly licensed. So once you start engaging with other people who are addressing these issues, you'll find that you develop your own support system, your own personal learning network to support you in the work that you're doing with your students. So I highly recommend this whole webinar series, and if you're interested, you might tune in tomorrow. Another resource for those of you who are thinking about moving students into doing more work on the open web, or perhaps are doing that already, is the Open Pedagogy Network. This is an open resource created by two educators I admire greatly, Rajiv Jangiani and Robin DeRosa, both in the US. They created the Open Pedagogy Notebook, they created the shell and the rationale, but they invite contributors from educators globally, and there are examples from all over the world here. So they define open pedagogy, they have examples. You'll surely be able to find some example that might be relevant to you, to your students, and you can submit an idea. If you're doing something that you think has been really useful in working with your students on the open web, you can submit it to the Open Pedagogy Notebook. And that invitation is open to staff, to students, to anyone, people outside higher education as well. So a highly recommended resource. Does anyone in the room get their students writing Wikipedia articles or editing Wikipedia articles? A few people. Okay, wonderful. Wikipedia is probably the primary source that we and students go to find an introduction to any topic that you might be could possibly think of. And for a long time, educators were loath to address it and thought, oh, don't trust that. You know, anybody can write to that. But with skills that, if you understand Wikipedia and be able to look at the history tab, the authorship, the sources, it can be a very powerful tool. And many educators have found that because so many people use it, that is precisely what makes it a tool that would be useful for us as academics and as students, because we can be creating the knowledge that people are drawing on every day. So Ewan McAndrew at the University of Edinburgh was what was called the Wikimedian in residence. He was in that post in 2016. It was for 2 years. It got extended for a 3rd year, and now it's been made indefinite because it's been so successful. And it was a very long URL, but if you just look up Wikimedian in residence at University of Edinburgh, you can find a whole wiki with countless sources for how to get started for teaching with Wikipedia. And I love his quote, which is, "Don't cite Wikipedia, write Wikipedia." And one of the most powerful bits of content on the wiki is a whole series of videos of students talking about why and how they think it's powerful to edit and write Wikipedia articles. Students of medicine, students of law, students of social work, all kinds of disciplines. So if you're not doing that already, there's a couple of people who raised their hand. Talk to them, talk to the people who are doing it already, or check out the resources here. Another example is Equity Unbound, and this is a curriculum that I developed with Mahabali here in Cairo and Mia Zamora in New Jersey in the US. And we have been in dialogue in these kinds of personal learning networks that I talked about just a few minutes ago for several years. So we've gotten to know each other quite well. We've collaborated on different things. We met at an open education conference last spring, and we talked about the fact that we felt there was a gap. There was some good resources for developing digital literacies, and there were some good intercultural learning resources, but we didn't have any that kind of put it all together. So we decided that we would create one, and we called it an Emergent Curriculum. It wasn't a MOOC, it wasn't the definitive version of how one would do this, but it was something that we would, all 3 of us, use with our students in autumn 2018, which we did. So we describe it as exploring digital literacies with an equity and intercultural learning focus in an open, connected learning environment. So the work was open on the web. We had our students and ourselves interacting in various ways on the web, obviously asynchronously. Sometimes Egypt and Ireland would link, sometimes New Jersey and Egypt would link. And we chose as really the byline of that curriculum a quote by Lina Munzer, a Syrian writer, who says, "The only way to make borders meaningless is to keep insisting on crossing them." And this is really the subtext of our work. This work, I believe, is not only important, but really urgent in this moment in time. So that all of the ways that we can help our students to cross boundaries in respectful and ethical ways, developing the skills that they need, will make the world a better place, we think. And that's what motivates us to do this work. So it wasn't a funded project, it wasn't a research project, it was work that we were doing as part of our normal work in our respective institutions. The URL is there. There's a tab called Resources, so there's no need to step along the sequence that we used, but we invite you to check out the resources, use any of them with your own students, and if you want to engage in dialogue, we'd like to keep that conversation going. This is ongoing work, we feel. And finally, this is just the bit.ly link that we used in our workshop this morning, which has your contributions in it. One of the most powerful things we can do is just to ask students. Some of the basic questions, asking students, what tools do you use? What tools do you use to share? What tools do you like using? What don't you like using? Why? What could we use in this class, in this learning community that we have that could help us to engage with others, beyond the university? And partner with students, to design some of those learning experiences and even the assessment. So I won't say much more about that. We spent a long time on that this morning, but those are just 5 little words, but I think they're possibly the most powerful things that we can do if we want to engage in this work. So there's a lot more that could be said about open, participatory, and equitable pedagogies, and I'm hoping that I'll be finished a little bit early because I'd like to hear maybe how some of these ideas link with the ideas that Alex spoke about yesterday and what came up in the workshops this morning. Again, any one person can only speak from their own particular standpoint, and you'll be making sense of that in your own context, and I would like to learn from you. If any of these words incites your interest, if the open piece is interesting to you, if the participatory piece is interesting to you, if the equitable piece is most important to you, then please use that as the thread to start getting interested in it. It doesn't matter what we call this. Again, this is really about teaching in ways that are as equitable as possible and help our students be equipped, to work in the world, in the complex world that we all live in. I know from research that I have done that engaging in open practice, this was what faculty told me in my study in Ireland. It's complex, it's personal, it's contextual, and it's continually negotiated. So it's personal because the moment we step outside the VLE and use an open tool, be it Twitter or a blog or whatever, we create the identity of that space using that tool. We choose the tool and we create some kind of identity. So we're automatically making decisions about how I will express myself, how I will name myself, what avatar I will use. And this is work, and it's personal, because we may decide to distance it from ourselves, we may decide to be academic self, personal self, everything all together. Again, this is work. It's contextual, because it will be different if you teach French from if you teach nursing or mathematics and so on. And again, this came up this morning. And it's continually negotiated. So even though I've been doing this work for a very long time, it is still a series of decision-making all the time. And as I often say, nearly with every tweet that you tweet, you're thinking, will I send this, with this hashtag, with this message, with this photograph? So this notion of continual negotiation is true for all of us, whether you're brand new to doing open work or whether you've been doing it for years. So in that sense, please speak with someone who's been doing this work for a long time, because it doesn't mean that they're better at it than you do. They're making the same kinds of decisions that you will make when you start. And finally, again, I just wanted to end with a note about what I feel is the urgency of this work. Our contexts are complex in many, many, many ways, and they're even dangerous for many people, including some of our students. And Audrey Waters' quote, I think, is vitally important for now. We must rebuild institutions that value humans' minds and lives and integrity and safety. And to the extent that we can do that as individual educators in our individual classrooms, we're doing really important work. And I know that the Center for Learning and Teaching supports that work in whatever learning spaces and pedagogies you choose to use. Maybe you could do it again. I just wanted to end there with a quote. That's the second to last slide. It's a quote about hope, and I have used this quote in every presentation I've given since the end of 2016 from Rebecca Solnit, from her book called Hope in the Dark. And I would like to think that those of us who are hopeful about doing this work, it's an informed hope. There are many risks to engaging online and to doing this kind of work. I don't mean to minimize those, But what I do mean to say is that I think it's very important, and there are so many supports for you for doing that work. Supports here at your university, supports in the form of Alec and myself, who would be happy to continue conversations, in the form of your colleagues at this institution and around the world, people who want to engage in this kind of work. So I encourage you to be hopeful also, to take on board and help your students deal with the risks, but to move forward with hope. And with that, I would just say thank you, shukran, and I hope we can have a conversation now.
I'm going to invite Alec Rose, who was yesterday's keynote speaker, to give a response, and then I'll open the floor for questions.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. That was excellent. Hello? There we go. I've got the audio levels. Obviously, listening to you, I feel really great about seeing some of the same continuations in our work that I saw many years ago. The question I always am left with, and the one that I think it's not going to be for you to simply acknowledge and answer yourself, but all of us have to answer. I've taken some notes. Underpinning your work is that the internet provides very different experiences for everyone, that we should strive towards open and equitable experiences. So we think that my experience as a white male on the web is going to look very different than your experience. And so what might be more hospitable to me is very different. And looking at diverse classrooms, obviously I have the responsibility of making sure that it's at the very least hospitable for all of my students in a way that I can't expect them to be in these spaces which will be in some ways toxic. So I have to better understand that. So some of the questions, I guess, the key question is, like, what are the most important skills or practices for preparing students to live, to learn in these spaces that can be sometimes incredibly toxic, to deal with the racism, misogyny, hate, et cetera, in these spaces? So how do we build that resiliency, the ability to be strong enough in these spaces, but at the same time, if learning is, I'm a believer, obviously, of these online spaces, but if I didn't believe in it, I don't think I would want to do this, because sometimes it can be a very toxic space. So when we think about the skills and strategies, mindsets, et cetera, where do we begin? So I think, obviously, this is not a question just put on your shoulders, but I think it would be a great one to discuss as well.
Fantastic. Can I say a few things and then maybe throw it open?
Of course.
It's a great question. Our students and we are already online learners. We're already using these spaces, right? So one of the misconceptions I think that we can be part of as teachers is to think that the learning spaces where we see our students, be they online or in a classroom, are the learning space for the course. But of course it's not. So our students will be communicating, they'll be looking at various online resources, connecting with one another, having all kinds of conversations. So in that sense, I feel that as higher education institutions, firstly, we abdicate our responsibility if we don't take this on as our work to help students to be able to engage on the open web, because these are activities that they're doing already. And if we're not helping them to develop the skills and resilience and literacies that you're talking about, and modeling how to be a professional, a public citizen, an adult who uses the open web in ways that are positive and safe and healthy and respectful of others. So if we miss that opportunity to help students develop those skills and to model that for them, then we are failing truly as a higher education institution. Because one example that I often use is the first week that our students work, they will get a Facebook friend request from their social work client or their colleague in the company or nonprofit that they work. And if we've never spoken about that, what it means to be professional on the web, and should I do this or not or whatever, what kinds of things should I think about when I make that decision? If we've never talked about that the time that they're a student, then we have failed, right? And I know that's the nature of your work as well. So what that work is partly is helping our colleagues, ourselves, our students, together to realize that it's not a matter of choosing the best tools, the safe tools or whatever, but to have the ability to go into any tool or system or space that anybody suggest to you anytime how to go into a space like that and assess that ecosystem. What is going on here? What does this look like? What are the norms of communication and behavior? Is this appropriate for me? Is it appropriate for my students? You know, those are the kinds of skills, I think, those kind of meta-level skills, rather than, you know, how to use Twitter. So, you know, of course, workshops on how to use Twitter and how to use various tools are useful, but it's that layer above that, about why would I use this? What should I be careful of when I use this? And I think that's the important work.
Anybody like to ask questions, make comments?
You use the word participatory quite frequently, and I have an understanding of what that would possibly mean, but myself included, what do you do with students who have this anxiety about being in a place where you have, you know, it's very obvious to parents and to students and to faculty that it's sometimes a very challenging space to be in. And is it okay to just be hovering or learning without actually contributing to conversations? So students who want to use that space to learn but don't want to participate or put themselves out there?
Yeah.
Is that something that is...
Yes. First of all, I think that we, again, as an institution, we can never require any member of academic staff or any student to be open online, full stop. Everyone will have to make their own choice. And just as a personal story, in the research that I did, I interviewed 19 members of academic staff. I used constructivist grounded theory, so I did, you know, long narrative interviews and sometimes multiple interviews with people. And I found out that 3 of the 19 members of academic staff that I interviewed had some experience within their families of online bullying or harassment. Now, that is something that I would not have known had I not done that research, and would never come up in a faculty workshop, would it? I mean, no, people would generally maybe not share that, but these are individuals who would say, I'm not using Twitter, I'm not going openly online with my students, you know, I'm not going to do that. So they told me the why. So it gave me some additional insight into, you know, students and staff that we work with will often have very, very good reasons for not choosing to be open. So the way that I deal with that is to actually model open practices and model ways that you can be open without being personally open. So the courses that I teach are open. The course is open, I am open, and students can make their very own choices about what to do. So there's a hashtag so they can look at the open conversations that we're having online. If we have a visit with someone in class, they can see, oh, this is, you know, someone from Cairo, someone from New York, you know, joining our class. So they can see how it works, but there's no compulsion on the student to do that or to create any identity that's open. And in my experience, usually very few students choose to do that, particularly in the early undergraduate years. And so I think, although we are communicating the value of this, we also have to communicate that, you know, it's completely okay to make your own choice, that personal bit that I shared. And, you know, so it could never be graded, I don't think. And if it is something that's graded, if you're in a field like digital marketing came up yesterday, we need to talk about ways that you can be in visible spaces where you don't use your own name, you don't use your own personal email, you know, you can create, you know, a name that creates some distance between your own personal self and the self that's online. And that's what digital literacy is partly about. So this, you know, there are a lot of nuances around this work, but I think it's important to model it and to show it, and also to model ways that people can engage with open practices without being fully open themselves. Okay.
Other questions or comments? I have a question from yesterday that came after Alex's keynote, and I think she's not here, so I'm going to ask it on her behalf and it'll get recorded.
Okay.
Because she was asking about how, I think Alec was talking about how people from outside were mentoring his students, and like a lot of the work that you're talking about in terms of open pedagogy involves that. And when she asked me, how do I do that with my class? And she's not someone who's very active online. So I was just thinking about how do faculty who are interested in getting from point A to point B, what kinds of ideas would you give them Or like what kind of possible pathways
Yep.
could they take?
And then maybe Alec could respond as well, because I think that relates to his work also. Some of the ways that I have done this would be in a second year undergraduate course in IT. I partnered with, I was in a network called iCollab was the hashtag, and we were collaborating across 6 countries: New Zealand, Ireland, UK, Spain, Germany, Australia I think was there also. So the teachers were connected, and we all were teaching something quite similar, and we thought, wouldn't it be great if our students could share with each other? But the students didn't share with their identities. They were only second-year students, and many of them might not have made that choice. But what we did was we asked the students as an assessed piece of work to develop open educational resources on what they were doing. So some were in the form of presentations, others were different kinds of visual work, and then they shared those with CC licenses. We had them in collections. We used things like Scoop It and Flipboard and various tools that were popular a few years ago. And then that collection would be, a teacher in another institution would say, okay, look at this collection, and then those students would kind of springboard off that work, kind of respond to it, riff off it, remix it in various ways. So students could really experience, being out in the open, but it was through this thing that they had created. And then, of course, we visited each other's class. We created other ways that we could interact with each other. But it was, again, it wasn't about the person putting themselves out and taking that risk, but experiencing some of the positive aspects of open pedagogy in quite a safe way. Okay.
I would look for similar.
Mm-hmm.
So I support faculty as well, and I've done this for 20 odd years now at the university where I support faculty. But I found I would do sneaky things, perhaps sneaky, where if I knew that one of my faculty members had a new grandchild, I would introduce Skype to them, for instance, and give them those relevant connections. Or if I knew that there was a content-specific event going on that's in the network, I would introduce them to that. So finding the most relevant reasons to connect for their personal use for professors, they would often then let that influence the way that they brought in the pedagogy into the classroom. But it has to be relevant to you as a professor before you will make it relevant for your students. You have to believe in it. So I think anything that you can do to move towards that idea where this actually makes sense to me, this connects with me. And I think at the root of all of this, those people who I would classify as connected educators found it in their own lives first before they brought it into the classroom, and that's why they believe in it.
Yeah.
So finding relevance is really important.
Yeah. And can I make one other comment on that? It's are people in the room familiar with digital visitors and digital residents idea? No. Okay. This is something that Dave White, Donna Lanclo, and others have spoken about, and it's this idea that people use the web in different ways as different kinds of space. So digital residents would go to a place for an information interaction, to get some information, like to get some travel information, or to go to Google search engine. And digital residents are people who kind of see the web as a space that they move around in. So Alec and I shared, our presence online in that way. What I found in my research was I had thought that people who taught openly would mostly be digital residents, people who already were open in a big way. But what I found was a significant proportion of academic staff who chose not to be open, so they would be called digital visitors, but they recognize the importance of developing these capabilities in their students, so their students could make those choices for themselves. So they were doing lots of development of digital literacies and so on in their teaching, but not being visible on the web themselves. So that was kind of a new twist on it for me. So it's not ultimately required that you use Twitter and you have a blog and all those kinds of things to teach in this way. But you can share some of these tools with students and have discussions with students to inform and help them develop their own digital literacies and identities for the future.
And that model of residents and visitors is what came in response to what you might have heard of, which is digital natives and immigrants, which has been very, very widely critiqued in education because it's not a generational thing, and it's not something you're either born native or you're an immigrant. It's something you develop. You become more comfortable in a space or less comfortable in a space. And you can be a resident in one space but a visitor in another, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, there are a lot of nuances to the model.
Are there any other comments or questions?